Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Mark Becker here with Cathexis Partners. This conference that we're going to be going into, we have a lot of topics to cover today. The name of the webinar is the Peer-to-Peer Fundraising Journey, all about keeping donors engaged. When you're logged in, if you have any questions, everybody is going to be on mute. We're expecting over 100 people on the call today, so you will be on mute, but there is a questions area. So as you think of questions, please ask them there, and we will read those off. We're going to be breaking this up into a few different areas, so we'll be asking questions along the way if you do have any. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and kick things off. Again, my name is Mark Becker. I'm the founding partner of Cathexis Partners, and really happy to be joined today by a couple of the folks from One Cause. Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Hi, I'm Kelly Haig. I'm the VP of Content Marketing at One Cause. I also, in a previous life before this, was a fundraiser myself, a director of development. So really come at this for the love of fundraising, sharing insights, and really excited to talk about the peer-to-peer donor journey and landscape today. And I will hand it over to Jenna to talk a little bit about herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for spending your afternoon with us. Jenna Jameson here from One Cause. I oversee all of our research and corporate communication. So I will be your standard data girl on this webinar, talking a lot about some interesting stats that we found from a recent research study we did, as well as some other data we've seen throughout the industry. So as we kind of get started, I think, Kelly, why don't you give them a little background on One Cause and Mark on Cathexis before we dive in?
Absolutely. So for those of you that the name of One Cause is new to you, we've actually been around for 10 years. We were formerly called BidPal, kind of leaders in the mobile bidding space, and have really branched out into a full range of products to support nonprofits in their year-round fundraising. I think one of the things that we love to do is help connect nonprofits to more, helping them raise more through software. But I think one of my favorite things to do is get on webinars and just talk about what are the trends that are going on in the industry, and what are we seeing and what can we share, both from a nonprofit perspective and from a donor perspective. So sit back, relax today. Feel free to ask questions, as Mark said, along the way, because we're here to have a really great time and share some new information coming out of a study, which we'll talk about later.
And for those of you that are new to Cathexis Partners, we've been around for coming up on 11 years, so probably around the same time. And we've worked with over 850 nonprofit clients, and we have, one focus, and that's to use technology to help organizations raise more funds and engage more supporters. All of your organizations are spending a lot of money on different technology, and we help make sure that you're maximizing the return on that investment.
Great. So like everyone's mentioned, we have a ton of great stuff to cover today, and just a quick agenda for everyone on the phone. And we're going to start a little bit just talking about who are peer-to-peer donors, and then go through kind of what we're calling the 4 stages of the peer-to-peer donor journey, starting from getting their attention, moving into motivating them to give, then connecting them more to your cause, and then ultimately, how do we convert them into loyal donors? We will have Q&A actually at each of those stages, so you don't have to necessarily wait to the end, but we will also try to save as much time as we can for some questions throughout the end. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump in. Like I mentioned, we're going to kind of start off just talking about who are today's peer-to-peer donors, and just to kind of be really specific about who we're talking about. When it comes to peer-to-peer fundraising, you have your peer-to-peer participants, those that are helping you raise funds on behalf of your cause, and then you have the donors, those who are actually giving to the organization. And so some of your participants might also be donors, but for this specific webinar, we're going to just be talking about those who are giving to your peer-to-peer fundraising campaign. So let's move forward, and I'm going to throw it over to Kelly to talk a little bit about this idea of the fundraising journey and what we mean by that.
Sure. As Jenna said, we're going to talk about peer-to-peer donors today. And I think, with the rise of social media out there and so many new fundraising channels, live stream and Facebook, there's a great potential for nonprofits to really reach a whole new group of donors. But in this digital age of fundraising, we have to think about how do we connect with those donors, right? Everybody is virtual, and they may or may not be familiar with our cause. So how in this digital age of fundraising do we make those connections? How do we attract them? How do we motivate them? How do we keep them for our cause? We also know, with donor churn at the levels that it is, this idea of reaching new donors is great, but how do we keep them? And one of the ways in which we keep them is to go beyond thinking of the single gift or this transactional one and done relationship with our donors, and starting to broaden that out into really a journey. How through stages can we maximize what we do as nonprofits so we have a better likelihood of actually retaining those donors, and then if all goes even better, we can convert them into loyal supporters to our cause. So we want to encourage you today, and a lot of what we're going to talk about is this journey, this idea of attracting, motivating, connecting, and then ultimately converting donors, and what can we do at each stage to optimize that experience for our donors and increase our likelihood of conversion. And I'm going to, before I turn it over to Jenna, what we did is this data is coming out of a study that we conducted at One Cause. And Jenna, why don't you explain a little bit about the research and kind of the methodology behind some of the findings that we'll share today?
Yeah, absolutely. So last December, One Cause put together a survey surveying what we're calling social donors. So these are folks that we're giving to event-based fundraising, virtual online giving campaigns. Maybe they were sponsoring someone in a run, walk, or ride, kind of really specific set of donors. And the way we kind of approached the survey was to get a really good sample size, a U.S. Census sample representation. So, you put in quotas around age and region to really get a good look at what donors are doing today. The survey went out in October, so this is still very fresh data, and it was self-reporting. So these are all the data that we hear from donors themselves. So we're able to dig into things like motivators and really reasons behind their gifts and things that they're looking for and continuing it versus just looking at transactional data. So kind of throughout the webinar today, we're going to reference some data points from there, but wanted to make sure you guys had a good idea of where that data was coming from. Some of the interesting things when we look at the data set that we got about peer-to-peer specifically donors, we kind of looked at them in two different ways. One being this group of people that is sponsoring someone in like a more traditional run, walk, or ride, and we're calling them sponsor donors. And then we have this other bucket that we're calling occasion challenge donors. These are probably people that are giving to the more virtual peer-to-peer campaigns, the No Shave Novembers. Maybe this is someone's birthday campaign that they're giving to, and wanted to kind of just look at the demographics data on these folks. And I think what's really interesting about this, and we could probably spend, a whole hour just digging into demographics, but all generations are giving to peer-to-peer campaigns. Kind of when you see the percentage breakdowns, that's basically the percentage breakdowns of those generations right now in the U.S. population. So good representation across all different generations. You have good representation across different income levels, as well as male and female. I think it's kind of interesting that we saw that occasion challenge donors skewed a little bit more female, but I think what this tells us is that there's opportunities to reach all different types of donors with peer-to-peer. The one, I think, interesting biggest thing to me is, have you donated before? And knowing that this is a great opportunity to bring in new donors to your organization. When we're looking at those occasion challenge donors with, 49%, having never given to an organization before, I get another 36% of our sponsored donors being first-time donors. So I think that that's really a big thing to pull in. So kind of when we look at the aggregate across peer-to-peer donors, we're seeing about 47% of them are first-time donors from organizations. So I think that's really important to kind of set the stage that these are new people to your cause. They may not necessarily have the same connection as your other campaigns, and it's important as we're going through the journey to keep that in the back of your mind. So with that, let's kind of dive into our first step of the journey, which is that initial getting their attention. In the study, we kind of asked social donors, we asked peer-to-peer donors, when you're looking at all these different donation opportunities that you're getting hit with on social media and on email, how do you prioritize the ones that you're going to give to? And these are the three reasons that we saw. One is that the nonprofit is really clear in highlighting its mission, that it looks like it's going to be a really simple donation experience, and three, that it's really clear how my donation is going to have an impact. And Kelly, I know we've kind of dug into all of this, but I guess, looking at these three together, what's really important for people to keep in mind as they're building these initial campaigns?
Yeah, so I go back to that stat that you showed us a couple slides ago, which is the 47% are, new to an organization. And that, I think, shows the power of peer-to-peer to really attract those first-time donors. But at the same time, when you're going to get their attention, because again, in a virtual world, how do you make that connection if you're not there face-to-face or you don't have a personal relationship? It is really talking about your mission. It is that mission messaging, that connecting them to their cause, marrying that with an easy giving experience. Donors, whether they're peer-to-peer donors, event donors, donors in general, are getting sophisticated in what they expect, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. And ease is at the center of getting their attention, and ease you will see be at the center of getting of being able to keep them. And then don't forget the impact. Right? We hear a lot about impact messaging, and the donors themselves told us this is the third most important thing for them. Make it clear to them how that gift is going to make a difference. Be very clear and intentional in your communications about how you're going to use the donations to further your mission.
And so whenever we look at, where are they connecting? I think these shouldn't be surprising, right? The big three that come up is email, social media, in person. This is where they're hearing about peer-to-peer campaigns. I think what's kind of interesting to us is that we saw, especially with peer-to-peer specifically, that social media tends to trump email. That more and more they're hearing about those, via social media. In person still plays a role, and I think it always will be when we're talking about word of mouth, especially with something like social media. But social media, I think we're seeing more and more is the area where people are hearing about a campaign. Anything to add there, Kelly?
Yeah, I always think that in person is fascinating, right? In this virtual and digital world of fundraising, where in peer-to-peer you're connecting social networks where that donor may be 2 or 3 times removed, that the human element still remains, and you need to, as a nonprofit, find ways to leverage your actual participants to continue those in-person asks and communications for you.
So for each kind of step of the journey, I think Mark's has some really good tips and recommendations to actually make your campaign, your peer-to-peer campaign, stand out when we know it's a pretty crowded place. So Mark, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you to take us through a couple slides of recommendations for how we could make our peer-to-peer campaign stand out.
Yeah, great, thanks. First and foremost, how does it relate to the mission, and what are you trying to solve? What's the whole point of why you're doing this, why you're asking them to get involved? What difference does that donation that they're making individually make towards that mission? And how do you want them to feel about all of that? What's the emotional connection? What do you want to have that? What kind of feeling do you want to have resonate throughout? To that end, how do you get that? You tell the story, make sure your color, your photos, your color palette, your overall design supports the story and the emotions that you want to evoke. Make sure the brand fits with your overall mission. Kind of don't go off on a tangent, but make sure it all intertwines and relates back to your overall mission. Make sure your calls to actions appeal to your different donor personas. In other words, do you know who your audience is, and can you create kind of personas for the different types of individuals that want to or are likely to support your cause, and do your calls to action appeal to them? Next, does your hero image or your banner images resonate or speak to the different donor groups or personas? And then make sure, again, you're weaving in your key campaign messaging to connect with your audiences throughout all of this.
Yeah, Mark, I love this kind of checklist and thinking about it through the eyes of like the peer-to-peer donor persona that you're trying to capture. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I know that a lot of organizations spend time on those personas, and you maybe look at them once and then you kind of move on from them. But I love bringing them back in along the stage to kind of evaluate, the creative, evaluate the messaging, and I think it's a really great recommendation. And I think you had one more really good tip that I think is super useful for people that are putting together a peer-to-peer campaign.
Yeah, we always recommend a soft launch. Basically, launching your website, your campaign, and announcing it first and foremost to your staff, your board members, maybe your main cheerleaders, team captains if you're doing teams, really your passionate crew, your core team, if you will, and test out a few different things. Incorporate A/B testing of messaging, both in emails welcoming people on the site itself, and also your calls to action, and just make sure that they really resonate and get that feedback in the early round. And then by the time you're ready to announce it to the larger audience, it's already well tested and already seeded with hopefully a lot of registrations and donations.
Yeah, I love that part of it, that you already had some activity on a campaign before people are coming to it for the first time.
And I think this aligns perfectly with also what we talk to our customers about at One Cause as well, is this soft launch. And I think we're all in such a, we put so many hours and love and sweat and tears into these campaigns that we're ready to launch them. But don't underestimate the effectiveness of a soft launch. Its ability, as Mark said, to help you troubleshoot, work the kinks out before you roll out to your larger audience. And then also to just, as he said, seed the campaign so that when the larger audience comes, that activity is there. Again, you got to grab their attention, right? No better way to grab their attention than the social proof of gifts and networks already in place.
So with that, I mean, I'd love to open it up to any questions. We'll pause here for a quick, 30 seconds to see if anyone had questions on, the data or the tips around how to get your peer-to-peer campaign to get the attention of these donors before we move on to how we're going to motivate them to actually make that gift.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions come in. Thanks, everybody, for participating. Knowing that there are other people at the other end of the line is always good. First and foremost, yes, we are going to be sending out a recording of the presentation after the fact, and we can also include the deck as well. There was a couple questions about that. And there was a specific question, can you please define sponsor versus occasional donor again?
Absolutely. So for this study, the way we defined it was the types of campaign they had been giving to. So a sponsor donor was someone that has sponsored someone or given to someone's run, walk, or ride campaign. So more your traditional, on the ground peer-to-peer fundraising events. Where our other bucket, which we call them the occasion challenge donors, these are people that had given to a virtual peer-to-peer campaign, and it could have been examples that were given were, someone's birthday campaign. It could have been a virtual challenge like a No Shave November. A lot of the more creative, I would say, peer-to-peer fundraising that we've been seeing coming up over the last few years.
Great, and I think that's all the questions at this point. Oh, wait, there's a couple more that have come in. Let me see how fast I can read here. Do you recommend changing messages / call to actions for past donors that will probably plan to participate in your event again, and the one-time donors that you are hoping to re-engage and get them involved year after year?
I think that's a great one, and I actually...
Go ahead. I was just going to have Mark. I was going to see Mark's take on that, and then we could layer in our take.
Go for it.
Okay, Jenna, why don't you go ahead and lead us off?
I was actually going to say I thought we were going to hit it on it later in the deck because we're talking about how to re-engage donors that had given in the past. But I think that's a great piece for your personas that Mark was mentioning, of actually having a persona built around a first-time donor and a persona built around a repeat donor, and making sure that things hit both of those. Anything else to add there, either of you?
Yeah, I would just say I am pretty intentional at the start of my campaigns, whether it's a peer-to-peer or a regular fundraiser, of thinking through, as Jenna said, not just my personas, but my first-time donors, those I might attract to it, versus those who have given before, and arcing out what might be some of the different messaging and motivators that are behind them. I think we'll talk a little bit later on about what the ways in which you can kind of actually convert them, but I do spend time up front kind of arcing those two different groups out.
Yeah, I totally agree. Another question that came in is, how do you balance a direct ask versus a more persuasive approach? Also, how do you bring about a fresh idea for those stuck in tradition?
Mark, why don't you take a step at that one first?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a lot of A/B testing, knowing who your personas are, who your audience is, and just making sure you come up with different messages that you get responses that you're looking for. So when you're sending out, especially in your emails, when you're sending out requests and that, if you're not getting anybody to click through, or if they open your emails but then stop there, it's time to adjust your messaging and try a different approach. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, and I think the first time donor is a great exercise of, if you were to explain what your organization does or how you're going to use the money to someone that has no idea what you do, you're going to have to force yourself to be a lot more direct. You're going to have to force yourself to be much more concise, and I think that is a good exercise for every nonprofit.
And I'll answer the question of, how do you introduce new ideas? I mean, easier said than done, but, I always recommend starting with data to the extent that you can. Whether you're doing A/B testing, if you don't have the ability to do A/B testing, go and speak to some donors who have been first-time donors. What would have gotten them to, give again? Talk to people who've never given to your cause. What would help you stand out? Do a little bit of research. It's easier to convince people when you have information and data behind you. That's the easiest way to, I think, to often take a new step forward.
Well, and I think let's kind of keep moving into the next step of the journey, and we'll again take questions after this step as well. But so now that we've kind of gotten their attention, they've seen your campaign, they got that social post, they got that email, they talked to their friend. How do we actually motivate these peer-to-peer donors to give? And kind of going back to the data, we asked specifically, what motivated your last gift to these donors? And they kind of gave us these top 5 reasons. The number one being that it was easy to do. You still see the importance of the mission, understanding the impact, but of course, because it's peer-to-peer, supporting that person that asked them is going to have a big motivation in them actually making a gift. And knowing that their friends or family are somewhat connected to it. Just to call out one thing, when we talk specifically about first-time donors, knowing, almost 50% of these are first-time donors, those first-time donors will prioritize ease and supporting the person that they know over the connection to the mission. And I think that that's really important as you're building out a peer-to-peer campaign, to keep that in your mind of, how do you pull through that personal connection, and how do you make it the simplest giving experience that you can? Kelly, anything else you want to add on based on the data that we saw?
I just think it's interesting. So we've gotten their attention. Now, how do we motivate them to give a gift? And look at the similarity between 1, 2, and 3. They're almost just in a flipped sort of order. Ease instead of the mission becomes the number one thing. Make it easy for me to give a gift. Continue to tell me about why you're different, why I should give to you, and then what you're going to do with my funds. I think you're going to continue to see this correlation between ease, mission, and impact, and the order of those play itself throughout what motivates people not only to look at you, then to give, but then ultimately to stay with you as a loyal supporter.
Yeah, and I think don't discount ease. I think we saw in the study that we did that 1 in 5 social donors we talked to found like the giving was not very easy. So I think there's always opportunities to improve it, no matter if you're, maybe you haven't had anyone call you out and say, hey, it was really hard for me to give a gift, or call you on the phone and say, hey, I got stuck giving this gift. It's probably because it's stopping people from even moving forward. And so it's always something you should reevaluate. Kelly, I know that we've talked about this topic a lot, just of evaluating ease. So what would be your recommendation?
Oh, Jenna and I speak about this a lot. We have very passionate discussions about it. I would say this is where I challenge us as nonprofits is technology for technology's sake isn't good, but you're all out. There's a lot of us out there saying, oh, but I've got technology and I've got software, so I've made it easy. Not necessarily. And this is where we'll talk about this a little later on, but look at your technology through the eyes of the 47% who are first-time donors. Understand what you're asking them to do to go through to complete a gift.
Great. And I guess that kind of will take us to Mark. And I know that you put together some recommendations for actually streamlining that donation process. So can you take us through these?
Yeah, definitely. Whether it's your first year of setting up a new online campaign, or it's your 20th year or your organization's 20th year, either way, you've been in this in the trenches for a while. It might seem like a lifetime, and sometimes it is. But we always recommend that you step back at some point and look at the entire process with as fresh eyes as you can, and maybe even ask some coworkers or friends or family that aren't involved with it to take a look at it through fresh eyes and walk through it and check out a few things. Create your own checklist in addition to this. But some of the things that we kind of highlight is it obvious what I should be doing? How do I learn more to register or donate? Or support somebody? How many clicks does it take to donate? How many questions are asked during the donation process? And then ask yourself and your team, do we really need all of those questions? Because you want to reduce the number of barriers to that transaction as you can. So you need to gather the information that's really required at that time, and no more. If you're not going to be using it, don't ask it. You can always follow up with surveys and so forth after the fact for additional information. But take care of that transaction first and foremost. And as they're going to donate, and if they're going to support somebody, how easy is it for them to locate, search for if they need to, or receive information from that person to donate on behalf of them?
I think that one's so important, Mark. The data really showed, especially for those first-time donors, how they prioritize, supporting that individual person versus just the mission. And so if you, get a message from someone and then you land on a landing page that is no longer connected to that person at all, and you can no longer see the connection there, like you kind of could lose that momentum.
Definitely.
And so I think too, kind of, you spoke to this a lot about, minimizing clicks and everything, but, talk to us a little bit about the actual donation levels and showing the impact of that and what you kind of recommend.
Yeah, so you have to have your, first and foremost, your calls to action need to be easily found, right? So make sure that those buttons stand out. The give, support, register, make sure those are easy to find, and then tie, as much as you can, if it's a fit, tie to the donation levels to real life examples. Some examples from actual clients are $250 to cover a health screening, for example. That's one giving level. Another one from one of our food bank clients is $10 provides 40 meals. Not only does that show you how efficient, what you're doing with your money, but also how efficiently run the nonprofit itself is in support of their mission. So that's a huge twofer in my opinion. X dollars will send a child to school for a year. So however you can, tie those donation levels to tangible things, and use, again, clear calls to action. Every time every page you get to, make it clear what you want them to do on that page, or make sure you're sharing the information that page was intended to, or advertised that it would share. And when you're emailing, focus on that one call to action. You might have several different things you might want them to do. Like, for example, you might be trying to get people to participate or donate, but maybe you ask them to participate in the first email when you first announce a series. And if they don't take action on that, maybe you ask them to donate or support. So really focus on one clear call to action, and make sure you always use your action-oriented giving verbs as well to keep them focused and moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love the examples for the donation levels. I think a lot of nonprofits can get really creative, and I think it forces you to, again, be really succinct in the impact that the dollars are having. And so, Mark, why don't you take us through our last tip of this section, because I thought this was a really interesting one.
Yeah, before we get to questions for this section, just one tip, it can be controversial. People do have different opinions on this and would love to hear if anybody out there has a different opinion on this. But the numbers have shown that by simply providing an option on your donation form for donors to cover the cost of the transaction fees, you can definitely boost the amount of overall fundraising by giving that option. People will not only give the same amount they did, but also the additional percentage that you put into that form.
Yeah, I can tell you from our experience with our solutions, our customers love this opportunity to offer it to donors. They see a higher percentage of donors doing it than they initially had expected, and so I think it's always a great opportunity to let your donors help cover the cost of a campaign. So definitely recommend for folks to test this one out if you haven't done it yet. So with that, Mark, why don't we open it up to questions for this section? So we're talking about actually motivating the guest.
Yeah, any questions? I'm not seeing anything in the panel currently. Give it another moment or two, but if not, let's go ahead and move on, and we can always ask anything else that might come up along the way.
Great. So with that, I'm going to jump. So our third step along this journey after you've gotten that gift is how do you connect these new donors to your cause, and what are the things that can kind of fall into that. So when we look at the data, what we saw was that about 54% of peer-to-peer donors said that they were likely to give again in the same way. They were likely to give to this individual campaign again the next year, or support the same person again. And so for us, this is actually a really, I would say, optimistic number for nonprofits out there. I think when we think of peer-to-peer campaigns and retention numbers, folks don't necessarily set that as a high expectation for the percentage they're going to retain. I think if we look at, the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, we've seen that retentions have been pretty stagnant for nonprofits, and that's just looking at, your overall campaigns, sticking around the 50%. I know it sometimes dips into, 48 and up to 52, but it's been pretty much even right there. And so to see that when we actually ask peer-to-peer donors, now this isn't transactional data, right? This is what they're saying. They're saying that there is a likelihood for them to give again in the same way. And so it's really important when you're structuring a peer-to-peer campaign that you're not just ending it at the gift. You're thinking already about, okay, I'm going to bring in these new donors. How are we going to bring them in closer to our cause so that when we go to ask for that next gift, when we go to bring them in more deeply, we're already laying the groundwork there. So we, again, looking at the data, we dug into the folks that did say that they were likely to give again and understood, what was going to increase their retention or increase the possibility for them to give again. And I think we see the same things that we saw in the other sections, which was understanding the impact of their gift, that they had a very positive giving experience, and that they received those consistent follow-ups. So it's very important for these donors, and I think we saw that when they were evaluating donations, when they're actually making the gift, is tell me how you use the money. If they had a bad giving experience, that's going to have a really bad taste in their mouth, especially if it's the first experience they ever had with your organization. And then actually follow up with them. Don't wait another year for them to hear from you. They want to understand that they've kind of entered into a larger relationship with you versus you're just here to collect the money once a year. I think that these are really interesting things that came up, and kind of going on that receiving consistent follow-up. We actually wanted to create a poll for the audience and kind of get you guys pulled into this one. So Mark, do you want to queue up that poll for the group?
Yep, it is live now, so go ahead and on your screen just click what percentage of donors never got a thank you, and then put in your answer. We'll give that a few moments to go ahead and have people have a chance to respond. And I see responses still coming in, so we'll let it run for a little bit longer.
And it's not a trick question, right? This is just whatever comes to mind first. Don't overthink this one. I will just say, this isn't necessarily the number of organizations that queued up a thank you. This is the number of donors that said, hey, I never heard back from that organization again.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this out now, and we should see. the responses here. There we go.
All right. So let's see what we got. That 34% think that 50% of donors never got a thank you. 25%, 27% thinking that 25%. And then coming in third would be 5%. So I'll tell you guys that is pretty close on. You guys aren't too far off. The 50% folks, I'm kind of worried that if only half of our donors heard back from us, that would be pretty scary. What our study showed us was that 25% never heard a follow-up. And so thinking about a quarter of those that were giving to a peer-to-peer campaign never heard back from an organization. And just knowing how important it is to not only hear thank you from an organization that you supported, but also getting the opportunity to understand impact, getting the opportunity to understand additional volunteer or additional campaigns or events they can get involved in is a huge opportunity for nonprofits. And so that 25% number kind of scared us when we saw it. And so there's definitely some data constraints that organizations face right now. If you're doing your peer-to-peer campaign through a platform where you're not able to collect and see the data, or if you're, allowing for, do-it-yourself peer-to-peer fundraising, allowing your supporters to go and run their own fundraising campaigns, but you're not necessarily collecting that in a way that you can use the data, that can really impede it. And then some folks just are maybe only sending that one thank you and never again, and it's getting missed and lost and everything. And so Mark, I know you put together some tips for actually what these follow-ups could look like.
Yeah, starts with making it easy for your participants to thank the donors. Give them the tools, depending on whatever platform you're using, suggested messages, sample text, sample tweets, sample posts to Facebook. Make it really super easy for them to thank their donors, and then remind them to send personalized thank yous. In other words, you send them a script, but obviously they shouldn't sound like everybody else, and they should put their own twist on things. Just make it as simple as possible, but then remind them to make sure to do that. Also include tangible impact statements about where the donors, the donation receipts are, the donations are going to in your receipts, and your thank yous in your system autoresponders as well. Show them, let them know where their funds are going, how it's helping the mission, and regularly create regular updates on how you're using the funds. Again, where is it all? What the bottom line? To that same end, don't let it just end at the end of that campaign cycle. Include them in your monthly newsletters and your annual report distribution, so they can see the overall mission of the organization and how they're making an impact on that, and how you're being good stewards of the monies received.
I think the first point, Mark, I was just going to say, is super important, that making it easy for participants to thank is going to have a huge impact. And continuing that connection with the person that they supported through to the thank you is really powerful if we're trying to pull someone deeper in engagement, because we know that that those first-time donors, half of those peer-to-peer donors have a deeper connection with the person they're supporting than necessarily your cause. And so the more that you can carry that through, I think, is really important. Kelly, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think when we talk about, I know we're talking about donors right now, but this is also shining a light again on the importance of enabling your participants, those actively fundraising and getting the donors, and enabling them with tools, whether that be toolkits and messaging, and also looking at your technology to make sure your technology makes it easy for the participants to communicate on your behalf to the donors, so that they're the conduit by which we can make sure that we don't have 25% of our donors that aren't being followed up with.
Yeah, and I think it's totally not a sit it and let it ride. It's the prompting the participants. It's sending them, a text message when they get a donation. It's sending them an email, or popping up for them every time they're getting a donation, so they're reminded that they need to send a thank you on to that person. So I think we love these tips that you put together, Mark. So why don't you bring us home on this section with your last tip of this portion?
Yeah, tying it all back kind of in one bow is just make sure your social posts emphasize the impact of the campaign, and include images and video that really help translate what happened on the physical event, if it was a physical event, or what other way you can bring the mission alive through video or imagery online. Try to help make that connection.
Kelly, I know we were just talking about an organization that does a really good job of this, Well Aware.
Yeah, so for those of you who have followed us on our webinars, you know that we have a love affair with Well Aware. They're a group out of Austin, Texas, but they're the real, I think they're the every person's charity water. If you haven't had a chance, go look at their Facebook, look at their Twitter, look at their LinkedIn. They do an amazing job of using social posts, whether they're talking about the impact of their mission, whether they're talking about what a single gift can do, whether they're celebrating the results of their shower strike. They use social posts in a way to reach those donors who they may not have direct connections with. And so I highly encourage everybody, check them out. They do a very, very good job, and I think something that's repeatable for a lot of other nonprofits as well.
We do have several questions here.
Yeah, let's move into those questions, Mark.
So just looking for some clarification, are you emailing past donors of the event and asking them to donate to the event again, as opposed to letting the registered participant ask? And I'll start by saying, great question. To start with, you want to ask them, you want to invite them to participate, and by that register. So maybe move them up, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Then if their friends register, they will probably go back to that same list and ask them again. So it's all about a timing issue, and how you message that.
Yeah, and I would also say, I think just a slightly different take on this is, Human Rights Watch, who's a client of ours as well, they do a really good job of taking those donors and not necessarily asking them to give again, but finding ways to engage them, whether it be in talk series or volunteer opportunities or other ways to connect them with to the cause directly.
Oh, and here's a great question that kind of feeds off of that, sort of how to motivate donors who gave to participants who are no longer involved. I think that's a great one. That is a great way and reason, again, to ask them to step up and see if they'll kind of move up the engagement ladder and participate themselves. And if not, through a series of emails, change the ask from participate to support.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say we're kind of leading into the next one really quickly. For me, this stage of the journey is very much about, I would say, not getting buyer's remorse. Like having people feel confident about the gift that they made, reminding people that they made a gift, reminding them the impact of the gift. This is where you can do some more education on your actual cause and bringing them closer to it in this step of the journey, especially if they're first-time donors to your organization. So while I think when we get into the next one, it's very much of like, what's that next ask look like? What's that next opportunity for them to engage with you? I think that immediately following, a gift for the peer-to-peer donor, there needs to be this phase of where you're starting to do some dating and starting to tell them more about yourself and really make it clear, how the gift is having impact along the way. So, it's that initial thank you, and then it's following up, a month later, 6 months later, whatever it is, reminding them how their gift has made an impact throughout the year. Any other questions, Mark?
Yeah, another one here is, what's the number one reason donors give again? I'm not sure if you happen to know that.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes into, if you go back to that slide that we touched on earlier, which was like what was going to have the biggest impact on them giving again, the biggest impact on the retention was that they understand the impact of that gift. That was the number one. And I think we've all been hit over the head with, I get it, impact, but if that donor feels confident in that gift had an impact, they understand that impact, they are more likely to give again. And I think that you can't really discount impact. And so we've talked about impact on every step of the way, but if you start laying the groundwork, from that initial touch point that they get about a campaign, you're talking about impact, to the donation level that has the impact, to the thank you that talks about the impact. I mean, there's really no way that they can't understand it if you continue to feed it to them.
When I would just put it in a real life scenario as well. I mean, we're all, while we do fundraising, we're probably vast majority of us also donors in some capacity in our real lives as well. Like, what are those causes that stand out to you? What are the causes that after the first gift make you want to give again? They're the ones where, at least for me personally, where I have a clear understanding what my funds went to support, what the impact that was generated from them, both on an individual level and a macro level, and how and how my continuing to participate in that can further the mission. So think about those things when whether they're emails, their social posts, they're even direct mail, which is still alive and well. When you get those, what are the ones that grab your attention and make you want to do it again?
Great. Well, let's move on to that last step. And Mark, if there's any questions we didn't get to, I think we'll have a few minutes at the end.
Yep.
All right, so this last step of the journey that we're walking through today is actually converting these peer-to-peer donors into loyal supporters. And I'll tell you, the data looks good. I would say about a quarter of these peer-to-peer donors said that they are likely to become a monthly or annual donor to your organization. So this is, if this was true and we were able to convert 25% of our peer-to-peer donors to become monthly donors, like, how excited would your entire fundraising staff be? And I think this shows us opportunity. Of course, this is not transactional, but Kelly, I think when you and I look at this, we were very optimistic about this.
Well, I just think that there's a huge opportunity. Again, this is where I find the data fascinating, because we're not telling necessarily anything new, but it's the fact that the donors are telling us themselves what they think, and that a quarter of them said, I will likely become a monthly or annual donor if you do the right things. And I think the next question is, what are those right things?
So going to, I think, one other data point that I found pretty interesting in the study was that, I would say 89, almost 90% of those that were first-time donors said they would actually be open to an additional donation request if it came through a family member, friend, or colleague. So this is all about continuing that personal connection through. So, you're talking almost everyone that gave to your organization for the first time would at least be open to receiving additional donation requests. So are you doing it? Are you continuing your peer-to-peer fundraising, not just singled around an individual campaign, but how do you continue it throughout the year and thread in your participants and keep them engaged throughout the year, and not just on an individual campaign basis? Kelly, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, how do you, which is something we talk about a lot at One Cause, how do you turn your participants into ambassadors? How are you leveraging those that are out there with those social networks, those that are recruiting the donors? How are you using them and leveraging them and getting them engaged to ask beyond the campaign? And that's something that we're seeing a lot of nonprofits start to think about. Again, if we're thinking about this beyond the single transaction, beyond the single campaign, is how do you leverage those most loyal supporters continuing on in other ways of social fundraising?
So Kelly, I know you had some recommendations pulled together on, other opportunities that you could put in front of peer-to-peer donors. Do you want to walk us through some of these?
Yeah, and this is again where I say we put on our real life hats, right? And why do we engage with causes, or even if you want to think about yourself as a consumer, why do you engage with certain brands? It's not always when they're saying buy, 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 or give, give, give. How can you look at ways to create more impact in action, in physical ways, whether you're inviting them to a real life or a virtual thought leadership series? Again, I go back to Human Rights Watch. They do an amazing job of taking all of their donors and inviting them to different thought leadership series, whether you're finding volunteer opportunities, different ways for them to give or engage in your community, and then just connecting them with the community at large, inviting them to other events, galas, dinners, golf outings. As nonprofits, we're typically not just doing peer-to-peer. We have other campaigns, we have other events that we can showcase, and invite them to join a committee. I think the more ways that you can deepen engagement, the better off you will be in being able to continue on a journey past a transaction mentality.
Yeah, I think these are all really great, and each organization has their own unique opportunities like this. So these are a few examples, but there's probably something that your team's really passionate about, or another event, or another opportunity, or maybe you could structure a volunteer opportunity just for your peer-to-peer donors around the campaign that they're giving to. I think there's a lot of great creativity that can come out of this recommendation. Mark, I think kind of this takes us into, I would say, the ultimate great finish line or not necessarily finish line, but turning it into a whole circle is actually turning last year's donors into this year's fundraisers. And why don't you talk us through some tips there?
Yeah, I think you probably hear me beating a drum at this point on this point, which is moving them up, their engagement ladder with you, whatever that might be. So if they're donors, last year, really send targeted recruitment emails to them and personalize that if your system allows, or if you can run the reports to make it happen, to include how much their donations from the amount from the previous year or lifetime of that campaign, and highlight where those dollars are going, and share some stories of personal impact, or ground level kind of stories about where that money is going and how it's making a difference, and really see if you can turn those into participants.
Yeah, I love this, and I think a really cool way to do it is kind of this last tip that you put together of how do you actually reach out to them.
Yeah, have your participants, ask them to start their own team, right? Again, moving up that ladder, and invite the donors from the previous year to join that fundraising team. So it's just trying to move everybody up and along, and further engage them if they're having a great experience with you and your environment, even if it's just a nice experience when they're donating, a simple, easy registration flow, donation flow, followed by a nice thank you and information about where how their money makes an impact. That might be all it takes for them to get more engaged, more involved.
Yeah, I love that. So maybe I gave Mark to, your campaign last year, and then, this year you're asking, hey, Jenna, why don't you come join my fundraising team and we can have a bigger impact together? That's probably a step that is the first step for me, rather than, becoming an individual fundraiser on my own. But some people may be ready to make that step right away. They may have connected with you throughout that year and, different events, different campaigns. So I think it's giving people opportunities is just kind of the big message there.
Definitely. And I think we got a bunch more questions.
Yeah, let's move into questions for this last section here. Anyone do it?
Yeah, a couple of people asked for to clarify or state again the reference that you made. I think it was for Well Aware, where you said look at their website to check out their social.
Yeah, so Well Aware. They are out of Austin, Texas. They're a water charity that builds wells in Africa. Sarah Evans is the CEO. You can find her on LinkedIn as well. But again, Well Aware. Check out their Facebook, their Twitter, their LinkedIn. Their Instagram is very powerful as well. I think they give you a lot of ideas of how you can tie in all these things of the mission, the impact, the storytelling, and engaging your donors throughout the year.
Great. Another great question is, using ambassadors for peer-to-peer campaigns has been successful in the past. What is the best way to enlist and motivate them? And I can't agree more, right? I mean, peer-to-peer fundraising is all about having other people amplify your message and share it. And it's all about engaging them however you can. If you have the resources, if you have the time, if you have the setup that is a good fit, have physical events, invite those cheerleaders or ambassadors in, talk to them about the campaign, about what's changing, about how it's made an impact, give them all the tools possible to help them be successful. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, for those who want to check out our website, onecause.com, you can actually just search on ambassador fundraising. We've got a guide to ambassador fundraising. We've got some blogs just to share information about how other nonprofits have taken that and done that and put it into practice.
Excellent. Are there good practices for reaching out to new donors, cold calls, emails with follow-up calls, that type of thing?
Do you want to start with that one, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, it all starts, again, with everything we've been talking about is the messaging about, what the mission is, and stories, true life stories about how that's made a difference in somebody's or something's life, and how it is in action. I'd start there. Whether or not, I would say emails is the most efficient way, but nothing, beats an in-person or I'd stay away from cold calls personally. But definitely email, since you have that at your disposal once they interact with you.
Yeah, and I think the more you can leverage your participants to be that first touch or second touch to bring them in before they get an email from you just straight after, the better, just because you're continuing that connection with that person that they gave to. Or, if you're able to even create, pseudo emails that look like they're coming from that person, that's a more efficient way to do it potentially. But I think it's just connecting that experience through for them, which I think is a priority no matter what channel you're using.
I agree. I think both to what Mark and Jenna said, in that, I would stay away from cold calling. If I could, I would look at the mission messaging, the storytelling, the leveraging of participants. Also making sure that your technology has easy ways for participants to think and engage with the donors and message to them, and communicate, where things are, to the extent that you can keep that going. Because the power that we're seeing, at least, the power that the donors told us in this study is in part their social networks, and, hearing and being asked and being invited and being re-invited by their friends. So keeping that going is important.
Definitely. Oh, here's another one that's come up in a couple different ways, and is definitely a point of contention with me and some other folks. But as far as views on this, but how important is giving merchandise to donors, such as buttons, mugs, etc., or rewards or swag? Some swear that it's just a horrible idea. Others think it's motivational and a nice way to reward people. I think, anytime you're going to consider doing that, I'd focus primarily, first of all, on your participants if you're going to do that. The donors, if you're going to give them swag for certain levels of giving, something to consider. Maybe if it's actual a physical event, I like those kind of call outs on the stage, or giving them access to a certain VIP area or something like that. But usually that's more the participant side than the donors themselves. I don't know if you ladies have anything else to add to that.
I would agree. I think we tend to see that in participants, in the participant experience, as an important motivator for participants. But we didn't hear the donors talk to us that much about, physical rewards as being part of their motivation.
Yeah, just from doing past donor studies too, just across the board, it just always ranks really low in motivators. It's much more about the personal connection, an easy giving experience, understanding the impact of the gift, and the mission. If there's anything you could focus on, and we haven't hit you over the head with it enough in this slide deck, merchandise would be pretty low on a donor priority for me.
Excellent. I think we still have some questions that we're not going to be able to get to in the time allotted, but know that we will have a listing of all these, and we'll be happy to follow up via email with anybody that we weren't able to connect with.
Great. Yeah, so just to kind of close us back off, Mark and Kelly, I think the way that we if you're walking away with one thing, we kind of feel strongly that peer-to-peer fundraising isn't just about a transaction. It's really a donor journey, and thinking through each of these steps when you're building a campaign is really important, and hopefully you got some good tips along the way. There is actually a white paper ebook version of this that kind of details out some of our recommendations that we hit on the call, as well as some additional ones. I believe, Mark, we're going to make that available for everyone either in the follow-up email or today on the call. But it's going to be a great download, a good read if you're more like to digest it, or hey, you need to go stick this on your boss's desk because you have some good ideas. You can fold some pages on it or highlight something for them. It should be a really good resource that we hope you guys can take advantage of.
Yep, and we'll make sure you have that access in the follow-up along with the video and the slide deck.
Great. And, here's our contact information. If you're interested in hearing more about One Cause or Cathexis, very much appreciate this engaged audience with all your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them today, but otherwise, I hope everyone has a great long weekend coming up and your brains are buzzing with ideas to go tackle.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Have a great
Thank
day.
you. Thanks. Bye-bye.